What would be the main reason why you would not be Protestant? What's kind of like the thing that is just a deal breaker for you with Protestantism?
Yeah, and that's hard. Protestantism is a very large target, so to speak. So you have some forms of Protestantism that are much closer to Catholicism than others. So a high church Anglicanism is going to be very much closer to Catholicism than a kind of low church Baptist Calvinism, basically. And so for me, a large portion of Protestantism, it is a deal breaker for me because I consider it to be unbiblical. Even if I grant that the Bible, you have the canon, we have scripture, it's inspired, and we just directly know that. There are so many denominations I could not be a part of because I believe their teachings are unbiblical. Calvinism is unbiblical. Denial of baptismal regeneration is unbiblical. And I've had my dialogue with Gavin Ortland on that and engaged on that. So that's one reason it's a deal breaker. I also think sola fide is unbiblical. I think you have to really bend yourself into pretzels to explain the teaching in James 2, the doctrine of merits and reward, even going back to Romans chapter 2. So that is a problem to me that for me, I think it contradicts the biblical data is number one. But even there, what I try to do and what I'm trying to encourage people to do when it comes to debating Catholicism and Protestantism is that it should not be, well, if Catholicism can't prove that it's true, we should be Protestant. No, instead, that would be like saying if theism can't prove that it's true, we should be atheists. No, even if you can't prove God exists, doesn't mean you should be an atheist who denies the existence of God. You just be agnostic on the question. Much like even if Catholicism cannot be proven to be true, it doesn't mean therefore Protestantism, which says there is no infallible authority beyond Scripture, it still hasn't proven that claim is true. So for me, Catholicism has an authority structure, Scripture, tradition, magisterium. Protestantism has an authority structure, 66 books, inspired. Many would say inerrant. The sole infallible rule of faith. And that can be unpacked even more. My question is, why should I believe that that is true, that authority structure? Where is the evidence for that? So the deal breaker for me is that I can't get to that. Because for me, in my conversion experience, it was, hey, there's a God. I look at the historical evidence, strict historical. I read the New Testament like it's just man-made documents. I come to the conclusion that Christ did rise from the dead. And he had this earthly ministry. Now what? So it's like I followed philosophical evidence, there's a God, historical evidence, Christ rose from the dead. And then I'm just supposed to say, oh, and now I believe these 66 books are inspired, inerrant, sole infallible rule of faith. Wait. That's a jump. That's a huge jump. Why couldn't I just say, well, I believe Jesus rose from the dead, and after that, I'm not sure what I should believe. Or I'm just going to listen to the words of Jesus and consider the rest of the New Testament to be helpful guidance, but that's it, not normatively binding. What objection could a Protestant make to that? They could say, well, but it's Scripture. Okay, what does that mean? Where's the evidence for that? Why should I believe? And people will try to patch together things. Because I would say, for example, for Protestants, prove that the Gospel of Mark is Scripture. Why should I care what is written down in the Gospel of Mark? It wasn't written by an apostle. It's not cited as Scripture in the New Testament. Paul does reference Luke as being Scripture, but not necessarily the entire Gospel of Luke. Yeah. But Mark is not written by an apostle, not cited as Scripture. Why would I accept that? Why would I accept Hebrews? What about Revelation? What about the letters of John? Philemon looks like a personal correspondence. I don't, what does that have to do with me today? Yeah. So it seems to me so for me, the deal breaker is just, this is your authority structure. And I've talked to Protestant apologists. I had a conversation with two Protestants and I brought up this question. And they said that they don't like mere Christian theism apologetics for this reason of doing the whole William Lane Craig arguments for God, then resurrection. Because then how do you get from there to Protestant authority? Because for many of them Protestants I've talked to, here's my problem. They'd say, well, I'm a presuppositionalist. I would just say that we have to start with Scripture as our foundation. And I would say, and I can't do that because that involves begging the question. Whether you are a Protestant presuppositionalist, a Catholic presuppositionalist, an Orthodox presuppositionalist, not pointing out particular people, but I mean, the labels will fall where they will. I find it to be a massive act of circular reasoning that doesn't become valid just because it's the one circular reasoning that I need to make the system work.
Yeah.
Something doesn't stop being a logical fallacy just because it's the one thing you need to make the system work. So, but in any case, yeah, I think that for me, all of that together, that what makes sense is I can follow natural theology to come to a mere Christian theism, but to get to the idea of having even Scripture itself, I feel like I have to make a giant leap with Protestantism. But with Catholicism, I can get there historically, because when I read the Bible just historically to figure out what's the authority supposed to be, and I'll just be frankly honest, when I read the New Testament, it shouts at me that the authority for Christians are the apostles.
Yeah.
Like when I read it, it's like, if I was to read it, who is my authority? And I read the New Testament, the answer that shouts at me are the apostles are your authority.
Sure.
Not Scripture or a collection of Scripture. And I'll admit that it doesn't shout at me successors of the apostles. But to me, if it shouts the apostles are the authorities, I think the evidence leans further in the direction that the authority is not going to be whatever they wrote down. Because even during the time of inscripturation, we had apostolic writings, but nobody says that these are going to become the rule of faith. Mm-hmm. Rather, it's their successors. And then when I get into the apostolic fathers, when I get into the church fathers, this is what's funny for me, Michael, that some Protestants, they'll say, well, look, we don't see in the apostolic fathers the universal primacy and jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. So why would we be Catholic? And I would say, where do we see a universal jurisdiction and definition of the 66-book canon of Scripture? Where do we see the fathers saying that this is the sole infallible rule of faith? You can get a few proof texts from Hippolytus or Irenaeus that I don't think prove the point. But you read Ignatius of Antioch, he says, follow the bishop as Jesus Christ follows the Father.
Right.
So for me, if they are going to be that skeptical, and I would say there is good evidence from Ignatius, from Clement, from Irenaeus on the authority of the papacy. But if that isn't good enough for them, of how the papacy is reflected in the early church fathers, so the papacy should not have authority, I believe that that is a killer blow to sola scriptura, to Scripture itself being the sole infallible rule of faith. We do not see anywhere near those citations for Scripture being that sense in the apostolic fathers. Absolutely not.